Okay, good afternoon. We'll get going in just a second. And we'll start talking about the election. Okay, so good afternoon. Glad to be back after our election season. I think everybody has calmed down. I think everything we had to hear and go through is over and done with. But we do have not just Branford to talk about, but the overall what happened in Virginia, the overall Democratic agenda on a national level to talk about. But we'll go over. We have a lot of questions that have gotten in on the election. Um, you know, I spoke to obviously many Republicans that are thrilled, as right as they should be. They ran a very good campaign. But a lot of Democrats that asked why. Like, why did this become the disaster that it became? And so that's a good question. And so we'll answer that a little bit as we go over the numbers, some of the things we were looking for in the numbers, looking at the Democratic strategy, and how this race moved forward. So, early on, a few months back, we knew any political scientist or anybody who has experience covering campaigns could look and say, okay, you have a very popular incumbent candidate who crosses party lines easily. You also have a town that is a 2-to-1 or more than that advantage Democrat to Republican with their registration. So the question is, how do you, if you are running the Democratic campaign, how do you make inroads with a very popular incumbent for a selectman? And after last year, with the presidential election, where a ridiculous number of absentee ballots came in, and COVID opened the door for a huge push for absentee ballots, part of the question would be, let's make this as national as possible. Let's go after the Democrats that basically are just loyal Democratic voters. You always refer to Cosgrove as the GOP instead of Cosgrove. You always refer to Republicans as the GOP. That's a negative connotation in liberal land. And you put mailers out that are, attacking almost nonstop. And so we saw that early on. The Bronco campaign, the Democratic campaign, started going after basically taking their marching orders from Wayne Cook and his attacks, and attacked the Tabor property, attacked Ecology Park. They were very weird attacks. And soon after those videos came out, we got a bunch of calls from people saying, I'm getting calls from people asking how I'm going to vote in the 5th district. And so it's not unusual to do polling, but the political parties were doing polling after those videos attacking Cosgrove on Tabor had come out. And soon after, you never heard Tabor again. So clearly that polling showed that was the wrong way to go. The 5th district doesn't want anything to happen at Tabor. It was nonsense. What it told me was that you had people leading the party who had very short-term memory or knew nothing about Branford, because Branford has been through the Tabor debacle ad nauseum. It's been ridiculous. Like, anybody with a brain says, I'm not touching it, I'm not mentioning it. It's been a Democratic bugaboo forever. The entire Tabor eminent domain case, if you go back 15, 20 years, you know that well, you know that disaster well. If you go back 9 or 10 years, one of the things that helped get Cosgrove in office was the Democrats' push to get public works at Tabor, and essentially a residential neighborhood. And that was a disaster. So that initial decision by Brockett to attack Tabor and try to talk about developing Tabor or doing anything at Tabor was always going to be taken the wrong way. It was a huge, a strategic mistake to start off with. It appeared they thought their big thing was going to be some article in the New Haven Register of some alleged plan by Cosgrove to funnel money to himself through a separate landscaping company that had been with the town for 15 years. Now, the Register clearly played ball. 2 months earlier, we had the Register reporter going to town, who, by the way, never had been in Brantford before. He is a children's book writer, and he wrote other things that had nothing to do with Brantford. Somehow gets assigned this article. When he's talking to town department heads, he said, "I was just told to do this." We don't know where it came from. And they start asking questions about a business that is renting space from a Cosgrove-owned property. It was nonsense. And when you read the article they wrote, it actually didn't have any accusations in it, except for from Tom Brockett and Kurt Schwanfeld. The article itself was very careful not to write an accusation. In fact, the headline of the article was Cosgrove denies wrongdoing or conflict of interest. It didn't say the Register was making that allegation, didn't say who was making it until they quoted Schwanfelder and Brockett. So I think they thought that was going to be their big piece. The Register held it for almost a month and a half before writing it. You can do your own math on that. It was a little bit crazy. And then you had that one mailer. That was shocking. It was just, there was a bunch of false statements on the senior center was $4 million over budget. The animal shelter is over budget. These are just not true statements. But then it got to the simple statement of during a live shooting incident that residents were kept in the dark. And I will tell you now, talking to the police officers after that, I'll tell you, Ray Dunbar has no support in the police department, despite being a former police officer. But that angered so many people. And this idea, they meant it as an attack on Cosgrove. But during a live shooting incident, Cosgrove doesn't handle communication. We don't want an elected official handling communication. We want a police officer handling communication. One of the reasons the police don't put out a ton of communication is because you don't want a ton of calls to the 911 center. They don't want to overflood that center with a bunch of calls with people saying what's going on. So they minimize sending out broad town-wide or shoreline-wide messages at that time. Their goal is to keep people safe. Now, Brockett could have undone some of that damage by simply saying, you know what? I screwed up. We worded it wrong. We didn't realize Cosgrove didn't handle it. It's hard to make that claim because Dunbar used to work in emergency response on that team. But they could have done that. Instead, Brockett doubled down on it. I stand by it. It's the truth. Cosgrove dropped the ball, whatever. And leading up to the election, there were a few things that Democrats actually thought they were making ground on. Maybe I don't know what they got when they knocked on doors. But they felt they're going to have a significant number of absentee ballots that were going to go their way. And they thought this hit piece from the New Haven Register was somehow going to go their way. Now, everything leading up to the race kind of told us that that wasn't the case. The Democrats took out 5,000 absentee ballots. By the end of the day on Monday, there was about 1,000 that had been returned. So we're learning that while those absentees, and there's this huge turnout in a national election we saw last year, it didn't quite translate to a local election. Now, that was still significantly more than the 3 to 350 we typically get in a local election of absentee ballots. But what we're finding out is it didn't represent a significant increase in new voters. It clearly represented voters that were likely already going to vote, had been accounted for in past local years, and just switched to absentee instead. Maybe because of COVID, maybe because it was easy, for whatever reason. And so when we looked at the numbers, we knew that if the Democrats had hit, say, 2,500 absentee ballots, and we figured they get 70 to 75% of those early votes, they would have a chance to make up some ground on Cosgrove. Well, it turned out, pull up the election results here. Cosgrove won every single district on election day. And it looks like probably at the end of the day won every district anyway. There's a chance he was closer in the District 3. I don't know what the absentee breakdown is per district. But ABs of about 1,100 ABs, maybe just under that. Maybe about 1,040 ABs. 582 for Brockett, 463. So that's basically, what do you put? 55, 40, even less than that, 53, 47. It really needed to be 75, 25 for the Democrats. It wasn't anywhere close to that. So it tells us a few things. Well, we had 3 years, in 2013, this is Cosgrove's first election against Campbell. we had 7,662 voters that voted in the local election, fewer registered voters overall that year. This year we had 8,029, so an increase of about 350, 306, something in that ballpark. And if we go back to the 2013 election, I'm going to pull it up now. Cosgrove got 4,484 that year. This year, he ended up with 4,484 to 4,914. Just, the miscalculation by the Democrats was thinking that absentee ballots were going to help them, and thinking that additional turnout would help them, and thinking that the register hit piece was going to work. It was a nonsense hit piece. And what you found was that those additional voters actually came out almost equally for Cosgrove. So it didn't help them just getting rolled in. Nationally, that works. More Democrats vote, typically they'll win. In Brantford, there's a significant advantage in registered Democrats to Republicans. In Brantford, it's kind of a different story because Cosgrove gets past those party lines. It's very bipartisan. His approach has been bipartisan. And what we've seen is that he's picked up Democratic votes more and more the longer he's in office. He's had a very pro-environment agenda, pro-senior agenda, pro-social services agenda, and he has used those things as part of his economic development agenda, and it has certainly worked. So going into this race, basically it was a question on my end of, Cosgrove's going to blow this out, or I'm missing something tremendously. Like there's some serious underground level of votes that are coming out that we've lost. But then early on, we saw the returns. We were averaging about, per polling place, I'd say 60 votes per hour, which is not crazy, which is on par for other local elections. We saw nothing out of the ordinary. I don't know what the final numbers for the Democrats is going to be on fundraising, but I'm sure it's $40,000 to $50,000. And overall, that got them nothing. And when the numbers first started coming in, I'll read them in order. I mean, the first district, I believe that came in was the 6th district. We knew Cosgrove was going to win that. 686 to 328. That's a 2-1. That's a beatdown. It's just a beatdown. Then I think the 7th came in. That's Brockett's home district. 543 to 278. That's a beatdown. And so the only place at that point that we knew the Democrats were going to be able to make up ground was in Short Beach and Stony Creek, which are the smallest districts, and the ABs. They lost the 2nd district on day of voting. It's not close. 492 to 338. That's a significant win for Cosgrove in a traditional Democratic district. District 3, Cosgrove won day of voting, 394 to 357. That may be closer when we look at ABs. Brockett could have pulled that out if we look at per district ABs. I'm not sure yet. But still, that he won the 2nd, that the 3rd was close, this was over. And there was never a chance. And then you had other questions. So the Democrats also had another goal, right? Was there a way to Cosgrove wins, but still handcuff him by taking over the Board of Selectmen or taking control of the RTM? And this is where the negativity by the Democrats killed them. So even if the Democrats had come out and run a positive yet losing campaign, like Brockett it was going to be a huge uphill battle for him to win. But he came out crazy negative and crazy dishonest, let's be honest. The things he was saying just didn't make sense. And he doubled down on them till Election Day. I heard an incident where somebody went up to him and asked him why he was making such false claims, and he basically shook the guy and said, this is all true. No, the stuff he said is not true. It's easily disproven. But then the question was, can they bring this get some ground by taking over perhaps the Board of Selectmen, which would require both Brockett and Dunbar to beat Angie Higgins. And we learned very quickly that wasn't going to happen. And we have a good comparison here. So 4 years ago, Linda Malo ran, and her running mate was Jack Ahern. And Jack Ahern is a popular former fire chief. I like Jack. He's a good guy. Disagree with some of his statements in that election, but good guy, respected guy. And we saw in that election against Joe Higgins for selectman, or 2nd selectman, we'll say, 4 years ago, that he was able to make up some significant ground. And I don't know if he won it or came close to it, but either way, he was a popular person. In this case, it was Dunbar, a former police captain, who just got destroyed. Now, he picked up some votes against Higgins, but Higgins won 55 to 40, 50, basically 56 to 44%. a significant win for Angie Higgins. So right then, any chance of taking over the Board of Selectmen was out the window. So then you're left with, is there ground to make up down ticket? Now, for many of the RTM members, I think they saw the writing on the wall. They saw that this was going to be a very difficult race to win. And so you saw them kind of running their own campaigns. I saw some candidates had their own literature done up. They had one had like a dog uniform, dog shirt on it with her name on it. Just some interesting things because they realized they weren't going to get much done. And so the question then remained is what were the coattails going to be for Cosgrove? And you do reach a point where Cosgrove wins by such a large margin that even if it gets closer down ticket, there was no way they were going to make up that ground. And so then you got to the Lisa Arpin race, which was town clerk. Lisa's running against Semino, who's one of her employees, who she hired, interestingly, but very quickly those numbers came in. The 6th district, 504 to 312. That was the first one. I'm sorry. It was 625 to 376. So Semino took some votes away from Cosgrove, but not nearly enough to make a difference. And then every district, Arpin won. She won the 2nd district. She lost District 3, which is Short Beach, that Democratic stronghold down there. Although it looks like Cosgrove did well there too. Then you went to Schwanfelder, and Schwanfelder did himself no favors in this election. Schwanfelder is a former Republican, and he became treasurer last year when Cosgrove was unopposed, when he didn't run. So there was no significant Republican race 2 years ago. But he won that. But he also, like Jamie, pulls a bunch of Democratic votes. Schwanfelder has history with some Republicans and would pull some of those votes. He likely lost that in attacking Cosgrove the way he did. It was so blatantly false and in many ways slanderous on Cosgrove, on a small business owner who owns a local landscaping company, who does work for the town. And so we saw Debbie Conklin win that race 54 to 46. That's an 8-point win. That's not a small thing. The closest race was, and I'm not shocked by this because, Roberta Gill Brooks, Black Lives Matter became a significant thing. She became active in that. She was getting press. There were profiles and different news articles on her. And the press in general refused to report the OPM report that raised significant questions about her ability to do the job. The letter from OPM to her that talked about the seriousness of things she had done in that department, including changing dates on payments. So that one Imparato was bringing big numbers in, but it was still kind of within, 800 or so going to the absentees. So you had that 1,100 absentees. My guess was that Republicans would get at least 300 of those. I underestimated it, but my guess was 300. So if you take 300 from the 1,100 down to 800, and then take that away, the Democrats can match that. So the most votes the Democrats can make up was about 500. I estimated it would be about 400, but that ended up being about right. And so they weren't able to, absentees in that race, 646 to 388. Gil Brooks was only able to make up about 260, 270 votes. And with 52.5%, Bob Imparato won that race. So we're going to talk more likely next week about that tax collector seat. I'm going to tell you this. As every Branford resident is going to be grateful that Bob Imparato won that seat, because that department's a mess. And what was reported was a small percentage of the mess that's in that department. I'm going to give, and I know I endorsed Cosgrove, but I'm going to give him some credit here. It was to his political advantage if he had come out a year ago and said, she's a mess, the department's a mess. He never did that. He never came out and attacked her. Instead, he kept hiring consultants. He hired the former tax collector, Joanne Cleary, to come in. He hired another consultant to get in. And she's going around saying, well, we were short-staffed, and you could still do the job. And they did everything. Jimmy did everything he could to help her. But if you're changing dates on payments, if you're removing return addresses on envelopes, if you're setting some payments aside or holding off on them, that's not a right that you have. The tax collector collects taxes. They don't decide who gets it waived. They don't decide what interest can be waived. They don't decide what dates to put on things. And so it's a mess. I give Cosgrove credit for not using that politically. He could have probably 2 years ago used it politically, never did, and he tried to get her help. It just didn't work. And so Bob Imparato was a very good addition to that seat. So, and that was a clean sweep. And early on, and I think what we can point to more than anything else was an incredibly negative and incredibly dishonest campaign by the Democrats. And I've had Democrats say to me, what happened? We ran a great campaign. I watched some of BCTV's coverage and listened to Tracy Everson, who won, by the way, but I've called her on many occasions the dumbest RTM member I've ever covered. Watching that BCTV event, I stand by that. It kind of confirmed it. But this idea of, we worked really hard doesn't work when you're lying. And it's one thing for Donald Trump to lie about Hillary or Hillary to lie about Trump. That's a nebulous, huge political thing. When you're lying and attacking somebody on a local level, when you're attacking somebody that people know Jamie Cosgrove. They went to school with Jamie Cosgrove. They're on committees and commissions with Jamie Cosgrove, and including many Democrats who are on committees and commissions with Jamie Cosgrove. You're then attacking them personally. They take that personally. And this idea that he was in any way, trying to funnel money to himself just made no sense, especially when you understood this guy over 8 years never took a raise. He left $75,000 to $80,000 on the table by not taking a raise. I think he was turning around trying to funnel money. And then, and I know this because I obtained a copy of all of the bids that this landscape company got. And there were 8 total bids. They got 5 of them because they were the low bidder. It's documented. It's public information. So nothing happened that was even questionable. That the register wrote it is ridiculous. But Schwanfelder was clearly behind it. And the head of their campaign was Kevin Coughlin. And I've said this earlier on this podcast in the last few months. He runs press. He has relationships with all the press. And so you had the register write this hit piece that was nonsensical, but then not write about a tax collector where there are state reports and audits showing those issues. And they were heard at public meetings. Let me tell you a little bit about the state of our press. It's a little bit crazy. I don't know how you don't cover that. It's public. The video can be watched. It's there. There's no surprises. But that's the state of our press, and that's the state of our media right now. So a little bit crazy. The question, who are the people getting preferential treatment? I'm quite sure the town is going to do an audit, a far more detailed audit, the financial audit, fiscal audit of the tax collector's office. In the very, very near future, we may get more information on who it was and how much. Listen, it doesn't really matter what the amount is. If you're waiving fees, you don't have a right to do that. That's a serious offense. In the OPM report, a letter that came from the state, it said that she had removed return addresses from mail. I don't understand the impact of that, but messing with people's mail is a federal crime. So we have some interesting things to work out, and we'll do it in a fiscal audit very likely on that. I believe she will not come to work the rest of her term. I think her term ends in about 2 weeks. I believe she's not going to come to work during that time, which is might be an agreement. I'm not sure, but that makes the most sense because there's serious issues in that department. I don't wish, unless it's absolutely necessary, I don't want to see criminal issues come up here. I'd like to just solve this and move on. But the Democratic Party knew some of these issues. The letter from OPM, which is run by Democrats in the state, in the Capitol, came in May 7th. I published that to Brantford 7. There's no way Kevin Coughlin didn't know these concerns were real. There's no way they were unaware. I know at least one donor to their campaign, who's an attorney, was well aware of these issues, yet they still ran her. That says something about the state of the Brantford Democratic Party. It just does. And I'm not talking, like, if you're on the RTM, you're one of 30, it was like 45 people running, all right, so be it. But when you're handling money for the town, when you're handling tax collection for the town, and there's serious issues that are significant, and they could have gone and talked to employees, other people in town hall, and heard some of the issues there. I'm not by any means saying she's a bad person. I want to make this clear. I'm in no way saying that she took money for herself. We have no indication of that. We have indication of it. She just may not belong in that seat. And that's this question of, do you put people in there that are elected or popular versus people that are qualified? And I think we're going to see some changes where we're starting to put people that are qualified in that seat. The good news is Bob Imparato has been in finance his career, in banking most of his career. He's on the board of finance. He's the chair of the housing authority. Very strong track record of knowing the right thing to do. And he's probably the right guy for the job. Why do Democrats vote absentee more than Republicans? Well, last year there was a huge push because remember, Republicans nationally were trying to fight it, right? They were trying to stop early voting. And then it was just like open the door for everything because of COVID. So last year, and we'll give you an example. Last year, the race for the 102nd district, the Republicans were at Lenny's and the results were coming in. And the same day results were like very close. Like looked like Mark Riccio was going to beat Robin Comey. Now, anybody who understood politics said there's no chance. It just can't happen. But I was getting calls from Republicans saying, man, he might pull this off. And I was laughing, like, there's no chance that can pull it off. Why? Because like 80% of the absentees, and there were thousands of them, went for the Democrat. There was a much bigger push by Democrats to get absentee ballots in than by Republicans. This year, Republicans did make a push, as you can see in the numbers. It was not 80-20. It was 55-45 or 54-46. So Republicans did make ground on that. And then I would imagine even some of the absentee ballot requests sent out by Democrats came back, for Cosgrove. It may not have helped them as much as they thought. There is one thing I'd like to see change, and it's a law that I'll propose at some point. But, we don't allow political signs within 75 feet of a school or a voting place, right? There's a reason for that, right? We don't want your ballot next to people campaigning next to you or whatever it is. But when you send out an absentee ballot request form, there is no limitations. So we had absentee ballot requests going out from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It was going with political flyers. So there was a flyer that was completely dishonest by the Democrats that went out about Cosgrove with their absentee ballot application. And I think we should pass a law that says any party can send out an absentee ballot application. I don't have any problem with that. I have no problem with absentee ballots at all. People should be able to vote whenever they want. I do have a problem with that absentee ballot request form coming in with political propaganda. You want to send it from the Democratic Party, so be it. Want to send it from the Republican Party, but just the application. I don't believe we should be allowed to put political paraphernalia or propaganda in that same mailer. I think that's inappropriate. So that's something I'll look at in the future, and hopefully that happens. And then the question was, how big were those coattails into what really people cared about was the Board of Education. And I did endorse one Democrat, Christy Cantu. It is my hope that if there's a vacancy, there is bipartisan support for her to go on there. But we did have all the Republicans who ran won. Peter Burdun, let me pull up the names now because now I'm pulling a blank here. Burdun and Rayner, who were incumbents. DeLucia defeated Cantu, and that was the toughest race. DeLucia was one of the best interviews I did on this podcast, and very qualified. I think she adds a lot to the board. I think her and Tim Rayner will work very well together. They both have a business background, and the reason I want some level of business background is, academics tend to drag things out and overanalyze things. Business people set goals, set a plan in place, and they want to see measurable results. It's good to have a balance of not just parents and academics, but to get some people with business experience. And both of them are either a parent and a business person or an academic and a business person. Rayner runs a business school. Marie Watson got on. I'm not shocked Marie Watson got on. Jolie was quite political. I think some people raised some questions about that. Watson is a well-known name in Democratic circles. I know her. I have no issue whatsoever with her being on. I think she'll be a good addition. And Laura Troidel won over Neil Sullivan. Unfortunately, I didn't take a stand in that race because I never got to interview Neil Sullivan. There was a sickness in his family, so he was unable to come on. Don't want to hold that against anybody. And so Laura's on there. So I am imagining, remember, the Board of Ed has 2-year terms, 4-year terms, and 6-year terms. Many times people do not fulfill those long terms, which are kind of ridiculous. Um, so my hope, and I would certainly endorse this if it were ever to be the case, was that if there's any opening anytime soon, that Christie Cantu be put forward. And I would ask that both parties would put her forward. I do think she'd have support from Republicans as well. She's a good member. She adds a lot. Um, the only problem with endorsing the Democrat is if you are a replacement member on the Board of Education, whether it's 2, 4, or 6-year term, the next election you have to run again. So Christie would be forced to run again. And I would hope at that point maybe both parties cross-endorse her and she's on both lines so she can keep that seat in 2 years. But she's a good addition, and I think she should be supported to get on there. But, it's an interesting time for the Democratic Party. While local elections don't often come down to politics, we're seeing some dangerous trends nationally. We have a president his ratings are dropping. This woke political correct thing is hurting Democrats all over the place. There's no question about it. I watched this disaster in Guilford where the result was what I would hope for. The group that was claiming CRT was being taught or fighting CRT seemed misguided to me. I would not have voted for them. But on the Democratic side, there was some heavy nastiness, like just calling them the hate slate and basically calling anybody who disagreed with them racist was crazy. And in Guilford, you might get away with that because it's a far lefty, very liberal town right now. But nationally, it won't. And we're seeing more and more, we are seeing moderate Democrats stand up against it. But nationally, it's going to be an issue. And you have midterm elections coming up, and there's some huge red flags. Virginia was a shock to see that go not just Republican, but as significantly Republican as it did. And so just a surprise watching this happen, we desperately need, as a Democrat, from a national standpoint, we desperately need moderate Democrats to stand up. And I would have liked to see more Democrats locally stand up. We did. There was a letter that we posted. There were a lot of Democrats that voted for Cosgrove. But the campaign we just saw from the Democrats was an embarrassment to Brantford. And to those Democrats who watch this and want to know why you lost because Brantford doesn't want to be that town. Now, in a couple of years or whenever Jamie Cosgrove decides not to run, at some point that door may open and somebody else will get in there. But I tell you, running that kind of race will not win in Brantford. Nobody wants it. Guilford seems to want to have no problem with that. They seem to have extremes yelling at each other. Brantford is not that way. Voters don't think that way. The extremes are small groups of people. There's extremes on the right, and there's extremes on the left. But the people who actually want to get stuff done and move the town forward are moderates. And they pretty much match the job that we've seen Jamie Cosgrove do for the town of Brantford. I have not seen Cosgrove when they sent that mailer out attacking the police and then followed it up with that ridiculous article in the Register. I have not seen Cosgrove that fired up. And he's not someone who overreacts. He's not someone who gets mad very easily. This was wrong, and this was an embarrassment to the town. If you're a Democrat in Brantford, don't dismiss me as the crazy guy talking on camera. If you're a Democrat in Brantford, don't let that happen again. Don't let Kevin Coughlin from New Haven come in town, become a leader of your party, and run dishonest attacks on a candidate in Cosgrove that people know and like, who's done a good job, who's run the town well. It's not how you win. In fact, it becomes a stain on the reputation of the town. It's not what we are as a town. We'll talk more in detail about the national stuff on Monday. That's just my general wrap-up of this election. I'm glad it's over. Cosgrove put out a letter saying he was glad it's over. There were just so many false claims. There were mailers being sent to me every day, and they were all wrong. It was like this stuff didn't happen. It was crazy. You're going to have Ecology Park open. So we're going to add police officers? Because there's no way to secure it. The debt went up $30 million. Okay, tell us what project you didn't want. You can't just say I'm mad about the debt. You have to say I don't want the Blackstone Library, I don't want the school being done, let me know what you're against. Nobody answered those questions. It was just throw shit, and I'm trying to swear less, but in this case it works. Throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. And in Brantford, thankfully, none of it stuck. And that's a huge feather in the cap for the town that I live in and the town that I love. On that note, we'll be back Monday at 4 o'clock, and we'll start talking about stuff other than elections and other new stuff. If there's questions, if there's comments, if there's projects you want to talk about in town, I'll be glad to do that. And hopefully we can start going beyond just Brantford and talking more general topics as well. I will see you on Monday, guys. I hope you all have a great night and have a great weekend.